and also a participant in the glory about to be revealed, I exhort the elders among you, shepherd God's flock among you, not overseeing out of compulsion, but freely according to God's will. Not for money, but eagerly. Not lording it over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. Likewise, you younger guys, be subject to the elders, and all of you clothe yourselves with humility towards one another, because God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that he may exalt you in due time, casting all your care upon him, because he cares for you. I want to begin this morning by telling you that we want to share a message about redefining leading and following. Redefining leading and following. Now, I want to say I am so privileged to be your pastor. I would not want to be doing anything else right now with my life, but that does not mean being a pastor is easy. I heard a joke about pastoring which illustrates this. Jesus was walking along the road one day when he came upon a man who was crying. And the man said, he said to the man, "My friend, what's wrong with you?" And the man said, "I'm blind. Can you help me?" Of course, Jesus says, "Sir, I can help you with that." Jesus healed the man, and he went on his way. Now, Jesus continues traveling along down the road, and he comes to another man sitting by the road and crying. And he says to him, "Good friend, what's wrong with you?" And the man said, "I'm lame. My foot is lame, and I can't walk. Can you help me?" Jesus healed the man, and they both went down the road rejoicing together. Now, as Jesus continued on the road, now he comes to another man. He comes to a third man. This guy's crying. He's sitting on the side of the road crying. Jesus says to him, "Good friend, what's wrong?" The man says, "I'm a pastor in New York City." Whereupon Jesus sat down with him and wept. That's how I feel about pastoring sometimes. But all joking aside, in our cultural context outside of the church community, our understanding of leading and following has to be redefined. And Peter the Apostle is one of the best persons that I know and I could think of in Scripture to teach us about redefining leading and following. If you remember this young man in the beginning of his ministry and leadership with Jesus, he was one of those people who was young and brash and unrestrained and a bit of a loose cannon, known to cut people's ears off when he was actually aiming to cut their heads off. And you remember him. This is the same Peter that had the foot and mouth disease. Do you know anyone like that? They have the foot and mouth disease? Well, I started my ministry that way. You see, Peter didn't understand how to follow, and he certainly didn't understand how to lead. But by the time he gets to 1 Peter chapter 5, and he gets to this book of 1 Peter, he is later on into his life and ministry, and his perspective has been refined. His perspective has been redefined. And so he communicates this now in a way that communicates to us that there are some terrible consequences in the church and in our society if we fail to redefine leading and following. And all of us have to do that, because all of us, it doesn't matter how young or how old we are, we need to understand better and to redefine it according to the eyes of God and the eyes of Jesus, what it means to lead and follow. And I want to tell you, there are terrible consequences if we don't address this. I want to give you an illustration. In 2006, Japanese workers had higher rates of anxiety and mental illness and depression and suicide than ever before, and it is attributed directly to Western culture. We see what had happened is that in previous decades, Western business practices upset traditional Japanese values to the detriment of Japanese workers. And I want to share a little bit with you what happened. In an attempt to globalize, corporate Japan adopted the working practices of the United States and England. And what adopting these practices did is that it directly affected the health of Japanese workers. The intense competition and individualism generated by these practices of the Western in England, and the Western practices in England and here in the United States negatively affected the mental health of the Japanese workforce. And according to government officials, it said 60%, I'm talking about it in 2006, 60% of workers, they said, suffered from high anxiety, and 65% of companies reported soaring levels of mental illness. Directors of the Japanese Mental Health Institute blamed the infiltration of Western values for rising levels of depression among workers and the country's suicide rate, which at that time remained the highest among rich nations. The male suicide rate alone had doubled since 1976, all the way to 2006. Now, the reason I bring up this story for you is that if adopting the values of Western society so negatively impacted Japanese culture, imagine what it could do to the church community and to our society if we wholesale embrace the perspectives of the world on following and leading. Imagine what that would look like. So Peter the apostle in this text in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verses 1 through 7, he comes along and he says to us, I want to help you to avoid going through the trauma of what this will do to you if you adopt the world's standards and continue in the world's values, what it will do to the church. And ultimately, actually, what it will do to the society, because the church is supposed to be salt and light. But if we are not salt and light, then the society will continue to rot. We are supposed to be preservers. So Peter comes along now and he redefines our perspective on leading and following. And if you look in the text with me very quickly, you will see that in verse 1, he begins by telling us that leadership and leading is cultivated in the context of suffering for good. You cannot really be in leadership if you have not suffered. I know that's not something that we like to hear, but there's something here in the text that maybe we often miss. The text begins by saying in many of your translations, therefore. Whenever you see therefore in a text, you always have to know that therefore means that this is connected to something that preceded it. And so if you look at verse 19 of the previous chapter, in chapter 4, you will see it says, so those who suffer according to God's will should, in doing good, entrust themselves to a faithful Creator. And if you will read earlier in that text, all the way from verse 12, you will discover that suffering is a normal part of the Christian journey and experience. And so, if it is supposed to be a normal part of our Christian experience, and by the way, suffering for doing good, not suffering for doing evil. And so, Peter begins by telling us that suffering is the context for which, suffering for good is the context by which we come into leadership. And actually, it's also the context by which we come into fellowship. So he begins by saying, therefore, as a fellow elder and witness to the sufferings of the Messiah, and also a participant in the glory about to be revealed. So he's telling us then in this text that in regards to, he starts talking about, now he goes straight to the persons who matter in terms of leadership in the church. He says, I exhort the elders among you. So in regards to elders, which is the word presbyteros, where we get the word Presbyterian from. Presbyteros are leaders. They're to lead, he says, in this text, in contrast to the world and motivated by the opposites of what society dictates. The very opposite. And so what is this opposite stuff? Well, we look at verses 1 through 4, and you discover what this opposite stuff is. Don't ever take this for granted, because I want to tell you, especially in the current context and environment that we are in our society, it's happening all around the world. We see examples of the world's values and standards of leading, and we take it for granted, but the consequences of it are dramatic. He says, in verses 1 through 4, and starting towards the end of verse 1, I exhort the elders among you. And he says now, let me tell you what I'm exhorting the elders among you. Let me tell you what I'm exhorting the older leaders among you. I'm asking you, I'm exhorting you, shepherd God's flock. By the way, this is the first of 4 imperatives in this text, which tells us that these are very important. We are commanded to do these 4 things. But this first imperative is to shepherd the sheep. I exhort the elders among you, shepherd God's flock among you. Shepherd them. What does it mean to shepherd? That's not a word unless you really understand what it means to have sheep. Now, I grew up in the country, and a little, when I was born, I was 5 years old, born in England, in London, England, and my mother, as a struggling law student, sent me back to Barbados to live with my grandparents. And my grandfather was a businessman, but one of my grandfather's things was he was not an educated man, and he learned to make money from the produce of the land. So he had a farm, and he had chickens, and he had goats, and he had cows. Oh, how I hated cleaning the chicken coop. Not one of my favorite tasks. And how I hated cleaning the sheep pen, because the sheep don't smell good. Right. So when he says in this text to shepherd the sheep, to shepherd the flock, what he's saying is that you should lead in a hands-on way like a shepherd. You cannot lead like a shepherd without getting your hands dirty. One of the things I notice about raising sheep is that you smell like the sheep after a while. Why? Because you get your hands dirty, you're in the pen with the sheep, you're cleaning the sheep, you're feeding the sheep, you're checking the sheep for ticks and for all of the other infections and diseases that they have. So you cannot shepherd the sheep without getting your hands dirty. and you begin to smell like the sheep. So when he says, shepherd God's flock among you, he's saying you should lead in a hands-on way, and you should begin to smell like the sheep. And he said, now, all right, that's in contrast to what the world tells us is leadership, because leadership is, in the world, listen, I am better than you. I am leader, you are follower. I tell you what to do. I am in another level from you. And actually, the way I was raised, I went to a boarding school, and there was a problem. You have to practice that. It's an acquired taste, and you just have to have your teacup just right. And, look at those commoners. Can't even use a knife and fork. Oh, savages. Savages. But this is not the picture of the leadership that Peter calls us to and that the gospel calls us to. He says, you should shepherd God's flock among you in contrast to how the world will shepherd their flock, how the world will lead their flock. And so he says, let me give you 3 pictures of how that is contrasted with the world. He said, first of all, you should lead in a way that shows that you are serving willingly, not out of compulsion, out of obligation. So he says it in the text. Read with me. He says, not overseeing out of compulsion, but how? Freely. Say that with me. Freely. You know what that means to me? That means that I am serving willingly. Willingly. Oh, I got to do it this morning. Oh, gosh. That's compulsion. And then he says, in contrast to the world, he says, but according to God's will, not for money. Not for money, but eagerly. So he's saying here that we should serve eagerly, but not for, instead, in contrast to serving for dishonest gain. So elders, thank God there's not just one in this congregation. I find it so attractive with this congregation that I am just one among several elders that we share. That's so attractive. He says, serve eagerly, not for dishonest gain. Elders are to serve out of eagerness rather than exploiting their position for their own financial gain and greed. And leaders especially are to value heaven's treasures rather than treasures on earth. Why? Because this is going to fade. I was listening to last night to a program, it was talking about Michael Jackson. My heart was grieved that at the end of his life, as he laid on the bed dying, it discovered after he passed away that he was $500 million in debt. $500 million in debt. And that was the reason why he was doing this last tour. He was going to try to recoup all of the losses and all of the money, and they drove him to perform in this last tour, and physically he did not have the capacity to do it, and he knew it. But because he was so motivated by, it's not so much that he was motivated by money as that he was such a materialistic man. He has spent so much money that he was obligated to go back on the road and exhaust himself in order to recoup these losses. See, that's the treasures of heaven aren't like that. The treasures of heaven, they don't fade away. But then he says now, last of all, in this text, and in terms of leadership, he says now, but I want you to serve as examples, he says, in verse 3. Not in the end of verse 2, but freely according to God's will. Not for the money, but eagerly. Not lording it over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. Listen, elders, in contrast, the leaders of the church are, in contrast to the world's leaders, are supposed to serve as examples. Boy, that's a new concept. Rather than as church dictators. Now, if you went to Mark chapter 10 and verse 42, you will notice that in that text that Jesus spoke to this very thing. And he said in Mark chapter 10, I want to read that for you because it's a very important concept and idea for those of you who are younger and getting ready to move into leadership positions in the world. You want to know, how do I lead? Well, listen. Here's what Jesus says in 10 and 42. Jesus called them over and said to them, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles dominate them, and their men of high positions exercise power over them. All right? But notice what he says. But it must not be like that among you. On the contrary, whoever wants to become great among you must be a servant. See, it's in contrast. Peter is saying, look, serve as examples rather than as church dictators. Serve as those whose motives or methods of leadership fit a pattern of shepherding, of servanthood, of serving. And when you live that way and you lead that way, God will reward you when he returns. Now, I don't know exactly when that will be. I don't exactly know how that's going to look. But I do know that the Lord will reward you. You know, one of the interesting things that I have discovered about leadership over the years, especially in my last congregation after 9.5 years, is that I never really gave as much attention to the fact that while shepherds are watching their flocks, the flocks are watching them. Right? And while shepherds are watching the flock, predators are also watching the flock. And so what happens is that you wake up and you look up and all of a sudden, many years later, somebody comes back to you and says that, you know what, I was impressed not by so much by what you said, I was impressed more by what you did. And I was watching you. And you don't realize the watching that the flock does of you as an elder and a leader is cumulative. It's not a one-time event. And that's a peculiar thing I've noticed over the years. It's cumulative. People watch you. They watch you. They don't even know they're watching you. They're just watching you. and it's cumulative. Over the years, people finally get it, that's really just how he is. Or that's really just how he is not. So authoritarian leadership that the world purports to use actually does not benefit the people in the long run. I want to give you an illustration of this. There's an educator by the name of B.F. Skinner who conducted many experiments in which he taught rats. I'm not calling you a rat. But in which he taught rats to run mazes. And in some cases, what he used was a positive reinforcer which was food. That would motivate some of us, right? I like food. I love food. Really good food, tasty food. Tasteless food, I don't like it so much. But in some cases, he used this positive reinforcer, food. And in other cases, he used punishment, which was an electric shock. And he found that the electric shock motivated the rats to learn the maze faster than food. But the shock also taught the rats to fear the maze. And eventually, and listen to this, eventually, the rats refused to move, regardless of the degree of electric shock that was applied, even to the point of death. And I want to tell you, authoritarian leadership is like an electric shock to the people of God. It produces quick results, but eventually leads to fear of the cage, fear of moving forward, and people will shut down. There's only so far that fear and authoritarian leadership will take people. I remember I was a pastor, assistant pastor of a church, and I experienced what authoritarian leadership looks like firsthand. I remember the pastor of that church by the name of Pastor Terry Hornbuckle, who is now incarcerated. 10 years after I left that church, he was incarcerated. And I remembered when I was there and I was an assistant pastor, I was always a bit of a rebel because I was always complaining about his authoritarian leadership. Now, he was my friend, so I always shared with him in private, this is not right, and I remember I made a mistake one day. He was out of town, and I was preaching. It was the first time I preached at the church, and while he was gone, he had a speaking assignment at a mega church, and it kind of fed his ego to be invited to this mega church to speak. And so I was preaching that Sunday morning, and interestingly enough, it was packed. And the congregation responded so well that 3 or 4 people came to faith. And 2 or 3 people joined the church, and we had a fabulous time that morning. I wasn't expecting that. It was a sovereign move of the Lord, and I realized that when he came back, and I thought he would be excited, I said, boy, we had such a good time in the Lord. Of course, authoritarian leaders are very insecure. You know that, right? And so someone has shared with him that I really showed out. It had these people really excited by the fact that you weren't here. And that's the worst thing you could tell an authoritarian leader, right? You weren't here and we had a great time in the Lord. And actually the church grew when you weren't here. How does that work for an authoritarian leader? But, the people, what it was that while he was out of town, the load of authoritarianism and legalism had been lifted, and the people were just glad for a moment of this. I didn't do anything but preach the gospel. It was a simple message, But it was so well received. There was a spirit of grace and liberty there just for that brief moment. And the people of God never forgot that moment because I never got to preach again. Right? And I eventually left that church in 2 years later. But the point that I'm making is that he had a team of people around him and elders. He would not listen to us. He wouldn't guard his heart. He beat up the people. He abused the people. He misused money. He eventually fell into adultery, drug use, and was convicted of rape. You can read the story. I'm not making this up. Pastor Terry Hornbach. His entire life was destroyed, and his entire testimony destroyed. Just because of authoritarian leadership. But now Peter turns in the text now and he says, leading is one thing. But now I want to tell you, there's another part to this. Peter now shows us that following and submission has its place. Following and submission has its place. Now notice in verse 5, he now turns now, he makes a shift. And he says, likewise, right? You younger men, and here is the second imperative in this text, the second command in this text, be subject to the elders. Be subject to the elders. Listen, you know what it means to be subject? That's a bad word in our context, in our societal context. Because it's a bad word for women because as soon as they hear that word, it sounds like domination. It sounds like abuse. And when men hear that word, they say, oh, nobody's telling me what to do in this individual culture that we find ourselves in and that I was raised in and that I'm a part of. But submission in the biblical sense, submission is actually means to put yourself in your rightful place to help accomplish a greater task. It's motivated by love. And it can never be enforced sterilely. Never. You cannot insist that people submit. You cannot make people submit. Actually, I want to tell you a little bit about this word that's used here that is we translate as some of your texts will say submit, some will say be subject to, but this word is a Greek military term meaning to arrange military troops in a military fashion under the command of a leader. And in a non-military use, it was a voluntary attitude of giving in, of cooperating, of assuming responsibility, and of carrying a burden in order that a greater task can be accomplished. And I noticed something. Isn't it interesting that when you are going to, in Barbados, when I was growing up as a teenager, when I went back to Barbados, when I went to Barbados when I was about 5, from 5 to 17, I lived in Barbados. And in my teenage years, we were going to a school. And in the West Indies at that time, in Barbados, they did not understand the concept. We didn't get this from the British. We did not understand the concept of getting in a queue. You know what a queue is? A queue is a line. You notice how nice it is in America? We stand in a nice line and we wait for the bus. And the bus pulls up and everybody orderly steps into the bus, one at a time. We didn't understand that concept. All we knew is, here comes the bus. And everybody shoves, and you get in the bus, and you're pushing in the way. You push them out of the way, you push them out of the way, and you fight to get in the bus. That's called boarding the bus. And I really thought that that's how everybody boards the bus. So when I came to America, and the bus came, guess what I did? I just ran in the bus. But this is what happens. That is a picture of what can happen. There's confusion if we don't learn how to submit. Because submitting is putting ourselves in an assumed and rightful place in order to accomplish a greater task. So because we want to all board the bus quickly and efficiently, I choose to submit my right to push you out of the way. So I submit myself to stand in the line. It doesn't make me lesser than you. It doesn't make me less important than you. As a matter of fact, it makes me important because I am a part of something bigger. I'm accomplishing a bigger task. And we can't accomplish that without submission. In the military, they understand that, right? Because you said, the captain says to you, we are going to take that hill, troops. And they said, I'm not listening to you. I don't care about that hill. Well, then you get killed, right? Because you're down here. We're all going to die. So guess what? We choose to submit. We put ourselves in an assumed place so that we can accomplish a greater task. So Peter says there's a place for submission. Likewise, you younger men, be subject to the elders. The elders' task is ineffective if others don't choose to submit to them. Now he says, in the last part of this text, Peter shows us that Christian leading and following is not possible without humility. Humility. It's not possible. Following and leading in a Christian context is not possible without humility. Listen, and he uses now two imperatives in verse 5 and verse 6 to address this issue of humility. And here's what he says. Here's the first imperative. He says, and all of you, clothe yourselves with humility towards one another, because God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. And then he says in verse 6, humble yourselves then, therefore, under the mighty hand of God. Humble yourselves. So two imperatives in verse 5 and verse 6 address humility, which is telling you that humility is incredibly important. Now, what do you mean, what does it mean to be humble? By the way, this is not humility. I remember there was this particular football player, Terrell Owens. I remember Terrell Owens, you know. Terrell Owens came on one day. They had just finished winning a game, and he says, you know, I thank God that I'm so humble. Right? That is not humility. You see? You never thank God that you're humble, because you are not as humble as you think you are. As a matter of fact, you're probably not humble at all, because everybody else needs to tell you that you're humble. That's how you know you're humble, because you don't tell everyone you're humble, right? So what does it mean to be humble? The word in Greek literally means to become dirt. To become dirt. It means to have a modest estimation of yourself, to make yourself low, to level a mountain, to bow down, to become a person of the earth. All humility is simply the acknowledgement of who you are dependent on. Who you're dependent on. Humility is primarily a person who grasps that all of the gifts and all of the talents and all of the opportunities and all of the accomplishments that you have are from the hand of God. From the hand of God. Without humility, Christ wouldn't have submitted himself to the Father or made the sacrifice of his own life for the whole world. Without humility, there's no submission. Without humility and without submission, there are no relationships of trust. So you need humility for submission, and without submission, there's no relationships of trust. Without relationships of trust, you won't make yourself vulnerable. And unless you make yourself vulnerable, no one can influence you. And without the influence of others, you won't change. You won't change. So what does he say in this text and finishing out this passage? He's saying all of us, he says in verse 5, the second part of verse 5, all of you, clothe yourselves with humility. All of us are to tie humility onto ourselves in dealing with each other, knowing that God resists the proud. God resists those who have pride. Pride actually blocks God's empowering grace from flowing in our lives. Can you imagine that? That's scary for me. That's why it says that pride comes before the fall. It may take years, it may take moments, but eventually the fall will come. Humility, on the other hand, attracts the grace of God. And just as surely as pride is turning it off, humility is attracting it. And what does humility do? It frees a person to focus on other people. Because when you're full of pride, you can only focus on yourself. I remember in Barbados, I had preached a sermon at a church. I was invited to preach, and I had just preached a sermon on humility. And a gentleman came up to me afterwards at the end of the service, and he said, I know what you're talking about those proud people. I have accomplished so many things with my life. I have a PhD, MD, and a DD, and ED. And, he's rattling off this long list of things. And I said to myself, he said, yeah, I'm so glad that I don't have that problem. And I said, he talked, the entire conversation was about what he had done. And you know what it made me realize? Is that he was so full of pride that pride does not allow you to focus on others. Humility's power is that it frees a person to focus on others. It opens the door to begin to affect others as Christ affected them. So he says, all of us should tie humility onto ourselves. But then he comes to the real crescendo of this message, the real crescendo of this. He says, more importantly, not only should we humble ourselves with each other, but more importantly, all of us should humble ourselves under God. Humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God so that he may exalt you in due time. Most of all, well, more importantly, we should humble ourselves under God, throwing all of our anxieties on him. And what does it mean to be anxious? It means to have a mind that is distracted by many concerns. You go to sleep and your mind is distracted. Can't rest. That's anxiety. He says, cast all of those upon the Lord. Humble yourselves under the wonderful, mighty hand of God so that he may exalt you in due time. I don't know when, but in due time. Casting all your anxieties upon him. Why? Because he cares. He cares for you. And sometimes the reason we don't humble ourselves under God's mighty hand is because we don't really appreciate how much he cares for us. That's the reason why Jesus says, the text, Philippians 2 and 5 through 8 says, your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man. He humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. Folks, without humility, Christ wouldn't have submitted himself to the Father or made the sacrifice of his own life for us. Without it. So as we listen to this, I know you're probably wondering, you're saying, now, Pastor Mike, that's all wonderful, that's great, but how do we lead and follow like this? If I stopped right here and I left it, it would be nothing but a moral message, a moral imperative that I'm giving you. But I want to tell you that leaders and followers need the humility of Jesus to be in authority and under authority. Because all of us are in authority and under authority. Only in Jesus do we understand leading and following. On our own strength, I have got news for you. We can't lead and follow like it says in this text. We can't. We cannot. You can try it for a moment. You're going to get excited about it. And then you're going to fade. You're going to crash. We can only do what Peter is asking us to do and commanding us to do in Jesus Christ. And here's the reason why we can do that. Because Jesus Christ is the true elder that is the perfect shepherd leader. Jesus Christ. He is the ultimate hands-on leader. He's the ultimate hands-on shepherd. He is the shepherd that never sleeps, always watching over us. Can you imagine that? I'm going to disappoint you. Why? Because I'm going to fall asleep. I'm going to disappoint you because I can't be awake 24 hours a day. I can't address every concern all the time at the same time. But guess what? We have an elder, a true elder, Jesus Christ, who doesn't sleep. He's also the only one who perfectly modeled being in authority and under authority. And it says in 1 Peter 2:24, he himself bore our sins in his body on the cross so that we might die to sins and live to righteousness. So by his wounds you have been healed. For you were like sheep gone astray, but now you have been returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. So that's what it means to say, is that in Jesus Christ we are in life. And that life flows out of us and flows into us and flows out of us and into us and out of us continually as we abide in him. Only in Jesus Christ. Only in him is leading and following truly redefined, and only in his grace can we lead and follow with humility. Alex Haley, the author of Roots, had an unusual picture hanging on his office wall when he was alive. It was a picture of a turtle on top of a fence post. Strange thing. And somebody asked him, why is that there? And Alex Haley says, look, every time I write something significant, every time I read my words and think they're wonderful and begin to feel proud of myself, I look at the turtle on top of the fence post and remember that he didn't get there on his own. He had help. Well, friends, I want to tell you today, Jesus Christ is our help, that we may, as stray sheep, return to God only because Jesus Christ rescued us and gave us new life so that we can live a life of humility in leading. So if you are on top of the fence post, just remember, Jesus got you. And Jesus will keep you. To God be the glory. Lord, we thank you for this wonderful and incredible privilege to be able to lead and to follow with humility. And we are so aware and ever presently more and more aware with all that's going on around us in our world and in our society and our various cultures and groups, that leading and following with humility is not a given. So we want to walk in that. We want to model that. We want to demonstrate that. But we can't do it in our own strength. We can only do it in you. So would you come today, and even through the taking of communion, as we reflect upon and reenact the wonderful gift that you have given us, the gift of the Holy Spirit, who lives in us and works through us and calls us to you, and calls us to, and enables us to exemplify you with humility and tenderness. But Father, there's some in this room who don't know you. And they want to live like this. They want to lead like this. They want to follow like this. But they can't begin to do this and to live like this until they have experienced the new life in you. I ask that today that they will put their faith in Jesus Christ so that they would be reconciled with you, so that they would be called to live in life and to put death to death. And so we rejoice in that in advance because we believe that you will do this, because you want to call all men to yourself, to believe in you, to be reconciled with you through faith in Jesus Christ. Help us in that, through Christ our Lord. Sorry, I have to take a sip of water. Now, you know, one of the things about is really amazing about communion is sometimes we can take communion and